For our parable this morning, I want to read something very short that Jesus had to say, and it's found in the 12th chapter of Luke's Gospel. And the context here is that Jesus is trying to get the people to understand the spiritual season that they have found themselves in, that the time was now to act because their promised Messiah was before them. And we know that most of them still do not recognize this because they end up crucifying him. But regardless of their willfully chosen blindness, Jesus is trying to show them at least how to open their eyes so that they could see the proof if they wanted to. And to do so, he uses the weather to get them to understand that there are signs in the sky that go before us in order for us to be able to discern what time it is, what we should be preparing for, what's about to happen. Likewise, the point of the parable is to show that there are spiritual signs that go before us, and they also indicate what's going on and when the time to act is. Now, this parable worked great for the people that Christ was speaking to, whether or not they chose to believe it, and what I mean by saying that is this. Israel is known for its fairly predictable weather. Even where I'm from in Ohio, it's kind of the same story. Weather reports that are given there are usually fairly accurate. I mean, they make fun of it there just like anybody else does, but you could kind of trust the weather reports there. You could also look at the sky when you would go outside and you could see what was coming. I mean, if it was cloudy there, you knew that you were going to get rain that day. If you walked outside and the sky was green, you walked back in and went into your basement because it meant a tornado was on the ground somewhere. There were clear signs that you could see. Now, it would be a little harder for us in Wyoming to grasp this concept. I mean, when Shelley and I moved here, the first thing that we learned was that you don't trust anything that the weatherman has to say about what's going to happen. And many times, you can't trust what the sky has to say about what's going to happen here either. In fact, the first winter, we would stay home over there in the parsonage anytime they said snow was coming. We would stay home just to sit in our pajamas and look at brown grass all evening out the front window of the parsonage. Other times we would be exploring. We'd be 50 or 100 miles away from here because we wanted to see something, because we heard it was going to be great weather that day, and we'd get caught in a heavy snowstorm, all while Shelley was looking at a screen on her weather app that said sunny skies and beautiful conditions. But we would be covered in snow. 2 weeks ago, there were clouds all over Casper. It looked like rain. We got nothing. They were just teasing us. So as we read this today, take yourself out of Wyoming for just a minute and recognize that where Jesus gave this message, certain signs made it clear that other things were for sure about to happen. So it's Luke chapter 12, and it's just verses 44 through 46. 54 through 56. It says, "Then he also said to the multitudes, 'Whenever you see a cloud rising out of the west, immediately you say, a shower is coming, and so it is. And when you see the south wind blow, you say, there will be hot weather, and there is. Hypocrites, you can discern the face of the sky and of the earth, but how is it you do not discern this time?'" In other words, you're willfully not looking is what he's trying to get them to understand. Now, I have a second text, and for that one, I'd like to look at the very beginning of the first conversation between God and Moses. In fact, Moses has been living in Midian for about 40 years at this point as a shepherd, ever since he left the palaces of Egypt. And the Bible says that while he is out one day leading his flock, that he comes to Mount Horeb, and that the angel of the Lord appears to him in one of the most peculiar ways listed in the Bible. A bush is engulfed in flames, yet it's not being consumed by the fire, and it's right there in front of him. So it piques Moses' interest. He says, I'm going to turn aside and see what this thing is. And then the Lord speaks to Moses through this bush. Again, a very spectacular event. But it's actually what Moses says back to God that I want to focus on first today. And also what he says is what I find the most amazing part of the story. Not the bush, but Moses' response. So I'm just going to read Exodus chapter 3. I'm going to read verses 1 through 12. This is what it says. It says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. For I know their sorrows, so I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come now therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But listen to this. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? So he said, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Now, isn't that an interesting question? And I say interesting for a reason. You know, I've read that passage many, many times in my life, never really grasping what was going on there with that response. But somewhere in the neighborhood of close to 10 years ago, I was reading it, and something clicked with me for the very first time that I had never thought about before. You see, 40 years earlier, Moses probably never would have asked that question, who am I? Because 40 years earlier, by human sight, the time might have seemed perfect for the rescue of the Hebrews. And Moses would have seemed the ideal choice or candidate to be the one to do it. Now, why do I say that? Well, most of us are familiar with the story, but just to sum it up for a brief minute, Moses, of course, was born in an interesting time, a time where the Egyptians of old were pretty wary of the Hebrews. And they were wary of them because of how quickly they were multiplying among them. And so they had this feeling of dread about them, dread that someday there could be an uprising and that the Hebrews might just overpower them and take the nation. So the Pharaoh of the period came up with an idea, and he decided to enslave them. And then on top of that, he gave an order that whenever they had a baby, if it was a girl, it could live, but if it was a boy, it had to be thrown into the river to drown and to die. Well, long story short, as I said, Moses is born during this period. He's a male Hebrew child. He should have been cast in the river to die, according to the edict of the law. But his parents hid him for a while until they realized that they couldn't hide him anymore. And so his mother, who can't just drop her son into the river to drown, puts him instead in a basket and then places him into the river. I'm sure she's praying for a miracle that someone somewhere will find him. Now, she places him into the river, like I said, where he happens to float down to the exact spot where the Bible says Pharaoh's daughter is bathing. Now, the Bible says that this woman hears the baby crying, and some maternal instincts inside of her take over. She forgets her father's directive, and she has compassion for this helpless child. She saves him and ends up raising this child as her own son. Well, Here is the part that I'm getting at. Moses was a Hebrew. This woman, of course, knew that, but he was not raised as a Hebrew. Because of this event, he was reared in a palace as the son of the daughter of Pharaoh, the man who originally actually signed his death warrant. And my point is, he wasn't brought up as a second-class child either because of his true genealogy. And there's a lot of argument and scholarship over this, but my source today is just going to be the Bible. And even though Scripture doesn't mention specifically how Pharaoh responded to his daughter adopting him, it still gives us great insight on what happened. You see, in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is giving an address to the Jews, he mentions Moses. And in verse 22, specifically, he said that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds, meaning he was brought up as any other of the royal children would have been. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24, skipping a little further ahead in his life, also mentions Moses and says that by faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. So what those verses tell us is that Moses truly was raised as royalty. He was adopted in, schooled just like any other prince in Egypt with the absolute best, and it was only because of his own rejection of this status through what he does that things change. You see, that's why I said that 40 years before the burning bush, if God had reached out to Moses in order to tell him what he was going to do, I don't think Moses would have asked, "Who am I to do this?" In fact, I think 40 years earlier, Moses was a little bit cocky and already thought that he could get away with helping the Hebrews on his own without God through his status and because of who he was. And I'll tell you why I think that. Because going back to Acts chapter 7, verse 23, Stephen said that when he was approaching the age of 40, that it entered into his mind to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel. And the literal Greek translation there actually says it entered into his heart. In other words, at some point in time, Moses found out that he was not a true son of Pharaoh's daughter. Whether that was kept secret until this point, or he always knew, we don't know. But something changes in him around the age of 40. And he saw that he belonged instead to these people that Pharaoh's court, whom he lived with, was persecuting. And this affected him deeply. He realized, hey, this could be me. That's why it was in his heart. So we're talking about his emotions. This was deep. Now, maybe he assumed because of his unique status that he could and should do something about this. I think he also assumed that the Israelites would think this way also, that they would probably look to him because of who he truly was and his status and see that or believe that he could help them. But that was clearly not the case because the Bible tells us that things go south in this area very fast. In fact, in Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 through 12, it says that Moses goes out one day and he sees the burdens of the Israelites, and that while doing so, he witnesses an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and something inside of him snaps. He couldn't take it anymore, so he kills the Egyptian, and he hides the body, believing that he must now have the respect of his people. But the very next day, he goes back out, and this time he finds two Hebrews fighting each other, and he tries to break it up to stop them, only to be asked, kind of caustically, maybe sarcastically by one of them, "Who made you a prince or a judge over us?" Or, "Leave us alone, palace boy." You know, they resented him. They didn't appreciate what he did. And then he asked, or the man asked him, "Are you going to kill me too, like you did the Egyptian?" There was no appreciation for what Moses had done. You see, not only did he not gain their respect as a possible deliverer for them, but to pour salt in the wound, it was through the slaves' open talking about what Moses did that causes Pharaoh to find out. And then everything comes crashing down for Moses. In fact, we could say this: Moses' first attempt to help his people was an utter, humiliating failure. But you know, that's what I want us to think about this morning. And do think about it. By human timing and standards, if ever there was a man that could have helped the Hebrews through just his own status, it should have been Moses. and it should have been 40 years before the bush. A Hebrew himself, raised again as Egyptian royalty, a man with power, influence, and education, a door clearly open. But what happened? When he acted on his own timing, without discerning God, when he based his assumptions off of his own passions, his own power, his own pride, it was all stripped away from him, and he failed miserably. He lost everything. The mighty prince of Egypt was cast out a fugitive, and he became a lowly shepherd of Midian. And there's a little bit of historical irony there as well. Talk about adding even more salt to the wound, because shepherds were considered an abomination to the Egyptians. So not only did he lose everything for trying, but he literally was scraping the bottom of the social barrel now as a result as well. From a palace to a field, surrounded by beautiful people to living with animals. Now, fast forward 40 years, and this lowly shepherd who is pushing 80, probably thinking things are going to start winding down for him in his life at this point, is standing before this bush, probably a little bit bitter on this subject, yet here he is having a conversation with the Almighty. And God says to him, "Now is the time, Moses. Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." Well, I can only imagine the thoughts going through Moses' head in that moment. Thoughts like, Lord, where were you 40 years ago when I tried this the first time? Why didn't you help me then? I mean, why in the world would you ask me to do something like this now? 40 years ago, I at least lived in Pharaoh's household. I had influence, a little bit of purpose and power. If you were going to use me, you should have done so when you had the chance. But in case you haven't noticed, Lord, I've already tried this, and I failed. I mean, I had to flee Egypt in embarrassment for my very life. I am a wanted fugitive. Not only that, but now I'm an old man, and I'm a shepherd. No one is going to take me seriously if I show back up all these years later. At most, they're going to laugh at me even harder. I mean, I couldn't even gain the respect of the slaves themselves when I was somebody. And yet you think I will be able to convince Pharaoh now to set them free. Lord, who am I for this job? You see, here was the problem. Moses, even 40 years later, was still looking to himself just a little bit differently now. Before, he was confident enough in himself to believe that it was time when it wasn't time, and his own power when it wasn't his own power. But now he was too discouraged in himself to see that the time had come. Now he believed that he couldn't do anything. But that is when God reveals the great secret to Moses of why it will work. Because as soon as Moses asks, "Who am I?" the Lord doesn't answer by coddling him, doesn't answer by embarrassing him, or really talking about him at all. He doesn't give a modern feel-good message saying, "You are the great Moses who was raised as an Egyptian. You are enough." He doesn't say, "You understand these people, and so you have secret knowledge that will assist me in what I want to do here with them." Nor does he say, "Because they know you, they might be more apt to listen to you this time when you come back later." No, he doesn't say any of that. In fact, God's timing was perfect. He basically says, "That's the point, Moses, that you are a nobody." In fact, I think he intentionally waited until Moses' reputation was totally destroyed and that all pride about who he once was drained from him. And then he looked at this lowly, beat-down shepherd who is finally humble enough to ask, "Who am I?" And he responds by saying, "I will be with you, Moses. This was never going to be accomplished because of you anyway, but because of me. And I will be there every step of the way, so you will be able to do whatever I say of you." You see, timing was everything. And God didn't do this in Moses' timing. When his passions were red hot and he was ready to slaughter the Egyptians for the behavior, he didn't use a prince of Egypt with his influence to free his people. Why? Because then those people might think that it was all done through human power and might. So instead, He sent a disgraced and humble former prince, a man with no credibility who was found out to be a descendant of slaves himself, one laughed out of Egypt by his own people, and who became a lowly shepherd, one who was a failure in his own eyes, as well as in the eyes of the Egyptians and the Hebrews. And he sent him because he wanted the world to know that it was all through God, and things are done through his timing and his power. And then God worked fantastic miracles through Moses and brought his people out of bondage because he finally had Moses looking up instead of looking inward. You know, Moses just didn't discern the time, because when he wanted to do something, he was looking to himself. And like I said, you know, when he wanted to forget all about everything, even after the first incident, because of his embarrassment about his failures, he was still looking to himself. The difference was that this time he already knew that by himself he could do nothing. You see, up to this point, Moses' problem was always self. And the same was true in Jesus' time when he gave the parable that we read this morning. I mean, the Jews had been looking for their promised Messiah for a very long time at that point, just like the Hebrew slaves of old had been waiting for their deliverer. But they were waiting for this Messiah, this figure that they believed would bring universal righteousness, one who would be establishing a world of peace, justice, and the knowledge of God. And they knew that the whole reason why a Messiah was needed was because self couldn't bring about those things. They couldn't do those things on their own. But here was the problem. When Jesus actually showed up to do just what he said he was going to do and what they agreed he was supposed to do, they were offended by him. Offended because they forgot the original reasoning, and they had come to believe that they could bring righteousness to themselves through their works, by their behavior, because of who they were. They fell into the same trap that Moses did at the beginning. They looked to their status instead of looking to God. Well, I'm a priest. I'm a Pharisee. I'm a scribe. I'm part of the chosen holy race. I'm already holy. Jesus can't tell me I'm not. And so they blinded themselves to the signs all around them, clear signs on who Jesus was, and they were unable to discern the time when the Messiah actually came. They missed the opportunity because of looking to self. But here's the hard question this morning. Do we do the same thing? Because there are two sets of time that we're talking about, two sets that we need to understand, our time and God's. So think about your life today. Maybe think of some of the things that have haunted you for years. I mean, does anybody have any painful memories of failures that they try to suppress? I know that I do. But I want you to think about them for a minute and ask yourself whose timing you followed during those experiences. How often have we tried to force our way on a situation thinking that because of our influence or who we are, that the time was right and we should be able to fix the problem on our own, only to be laughed at in the end, and to find ourselves out licking our wounds, embarrassed at how things went in the opposite direction of what we intended, because we tried to force those things with our own passions, and God was not in it. Well, that's exactly when we need to remember that if the Jews couldn't bring righteousness on their own, and if a prince of Egypt couldn't set the slaves free through his own status, then we aren't going to be able to accomplish what we desire either if God is not in it. But yet this next part is equally as important. It's okay if we failed, because that's human nature. I mean, show me a human that hasn't failed in this life, and I'll tell you his name. It's going to be Jesus Christ, because he's the only one. I mean, Moses was a great man, and he was an exceptional leader, and yet we know that he also failed more than once. And it's important that we learn our lesson of humility when we fail. When we go at it and God has not said that the time is now, we need to realize that's the reason, because we were trying to do it ourselves. Moses did that as well. Like I said, he finally figured out on his own that he could be assured of nothing. But where we need to be careful is in not letting those failures continue to blind us to the signs that God has set all around us when it finally does become time to act. We must be able to learn our lesson. One preacher once said this. He said, Moses spent 40 years thinking he was somebody, 40 years learning he was nobody, and then 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody. And if God is emptying us of ourselves, then that means to get ready, because that means that He's finally ready to use us. Because just how being too high on ourselves can cause us to act before we should, being too down on ourselves can also prevent us from acting when the time is right. You see, the key is not self at all. It's God. That's what Christ wanted them to see. And Moses had to finally get to the point where he was totally reliant on God and on God's presence before doing anything. In fact, the same thing happened to the Apostle Paul, just to show how God repetitively does this, and he uses the same pattern. I mean, last week we examined how Paul had a little trouble with humility himself at the very beginning of his walk with the Lord. But the Lord helped him to take his focus off of self in a way that seemed unpleasant at the time, just like Moses' 40 years in the wilderness was unpleasant at the time. But yet it helped both of them, because in Paul's second letter to the church in Corinth, he told the church, just so that he wouldn't be exalted above measure by how God was using him, or in other words, not to think that this was about him or his abilities or through his own power, he said, "A thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure." Something to humble him. Now, we don't know exactly what it was that Paul's referring to there. Some scholars think maybe he was losing his vision. That's a possibility. We don't know. We just know that something was bothering him. But then he wrote this. He said, "Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And yet he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." It's not made perfect in our pride. It's not made perfect in us looking to ourselves. It's made perfect in our weakness when we surrender it to the Lord. And there you have it. That's what God was trying to get Moses to see, what Jesus was trying to get the scribes to see, what Paul finally did see, and what we need to likewise understand. In order to act or to stay still, to fail or to succeed in any situation, it cannot be based off of anything that we think about ourselves, but only on the clear spiritual signs that God sets around us, so that we can discern that His presence is with us and is involved. Self only gets in the way, but once it's gone, that's when we look out. So in closing, I would just say this one more time. You know, maybe you're in one of those 2 places today. Maybe something is before you that you feel passionate about, something that you think you should intervene in. Well, before you do anything, look around you. Take yourself out of the equation for a minute and see if God is still nudging you. Because if all you can see are the reasons why you are the candidate to take care of whatever the matter is by your own power or your influence, then you better start talking to the Lord and asking for confirmation that now is actually His time and not ours. Alternatively, maybe you are disgusted in yourself because you did try it something your own way and in your own time, and you failed and you made a mess out of things. You lost your credibility, and so now you think you're good for nothing. Well, you take yourself out of the equation also. Stop feeling sorry for yourself, calling yourself a failure, and likewise get ready, because you just may be at the moment when God is about to call you. And when He does, you don't want to try and stop Him with a pity party by crying, "Who am I, Lord?" Instead, you need to realize that His strength is perfected in our weakness, so that when you do step into that situation, everyone will know that what was accomplished was not from you, but because of God in you. But the only way that you'll be able to do that is if, like Jesus said, you're able to look beyond self and to discern the time that you are in. If you would, bow your heads. Father,